Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's middle game strategic lesson, we are looking at positions with opposite colored bishops in the middle game. Now, you have most probably heard that opposite colored bishops tend to end in a draw, and that's true when it comes to endgames with reduced material, especially when the only two pieces on the board are the two opposite colored bishops. In middle game positions, though, when there are more pieces on the board, when the position is complex, a completely opposite rule applies to most positions. So in complex positions with opposite colored bishops, there are much greater winning chances than with the bishops of the same color. And there's a very simple reason for that. The fact is that once a pair of bishops has been traded off, opposite colored bishops, then one side is left with a light squared bishop, the other one is left with a dark squared bishop, which means that they cannot oppose each other's bishops, which means that each side has one color complex that is in theory weaker than the other. Now, in practice, it may not be so, it doesn't have to be that way. But in theory, whenever there are opposite colored bishops on the board in a complex position, you have greater attacking chances. Okay, so I'm going to be using 5 game examples with, I think, instructive ideas. Hopefully they are instructive. And I'm going to try to show you some key concepts in middle games like this. Now, the point of this series so far, and hopefully when it continues, is that you recognize strategic ideas and strategic patterns during your games. Most weaker players think in terms of moves. Very strong players think in terms of clumps of patterns on the board. And whenever you reach a position like this, when there are opposite colored bishops, I would like you to think of this concept. The concept of weak color complexes and weaknesses that you can exploit because your opponent cannot oppose your bishop. We're going to start with a position which is equal, but because it's equal and because black, in this case Mikhail Botvinnik, managed to exploit one color complex, I thought it was very useful. So the first thing we can notice here is that the light squares are weak, of course, in black's position, so are the dark squares in white's, in black's position, and the light squares are weak in white's position. So each side would like to exploit those weaknesses fully. One very important thing which we have to notice is that black has a hole on e4 which he can use because the pawn has been advanced to f4. If this pawn was on f2, this would be a position much easier to play for white. In this case, since there is a gaping hole on e4, black can exploit it without white being able to do anything about it. Now we have to think in terms of strategy. Which is the only one of white's pieces that can control e4 without white, well, giving up the exchange or something even more radical? It's the knight on a4. So we know that we would like to exploit these light squares. Okay, we would like to attack the white king because we have a position in which there are opposite colored bishops, but this knight is in the way. So what can we do about it? The first thing that should come to your mind is trade off the only defender. So trading off this knight for this knight would mean that you have unopposable control over the e4 square, which in the long run means that your attacking prospects are higher because there's basically nothing white can do about the bishop being on e4, striking across the entire board. So there are a couple of ways to play this position. I don't want to get into other strategic concepts. I would just like to show you what Botvinnik did and how he managed to exploit this. The other thing is this knight is sort of stranded on the edge of the board. There are two ways for it to come back into the position. Now prophylaxis comes into play because your opponent has a color complex to exploit as well. He wants to exploit the dark squares. The best way to do that would be to play something like knight b2, knight d3 and get into one of these two squares. Of course, you never want to give up your bishop on d3. because you would lose your strategic edge in that case, or at least your part of the strategic edge. So what you have to do is you have to control this knight in advance. Luckily for black, he hasn't rushed out with his pawns yet, and he has the option to play the move b6, restraining the knight from coming into c5. He also has the option to play the move f6, restraining the knight from ever going for this maneuver, knight b2, knight d3, knight e5, or knight c5. And in case the knight wishes to come back into the game via c3, then you can simply trade it off and you have achieved your strategic aim. Now, I'm not saying in the case of these knights being traded off, black is immediately winning. I'm saying that strategically that makes sense because it increases your control over the light squares. So let's see what happened. And again, this kind of thinking is what I think is very useful to apply during a real game. Botvinnik started with knight e4. It's a tempo on the rook. Fine. The rook drops back. And now you don't want to allow knight c5, or fine, you could because you can trade it off, but you start your restriction anyway. b6. Okay. Now the knight doesn't have this square. If it goes here, you can simply trade it off. The maneuver knight b2, knight d3, knight e5 can be simply prevented with the move f6 because now the knight has moved. Rook f to d1 was played by Alexander Kotov, and pawn to f6. Perfect prophylaxis. First stage of our plan is done. This knight now has no future on the b2 square. Absolutely no future. I mean, it could do this, but even so, I mean, you can trade it off on f2 then. Okay, knight c3 played by Kotov, and that was snapped off. Takes, and rook takes, and now bishop to e4. And the position has somewhat simplified. You could say that black has wasted time on f6 and b6. It's still equal according to the engines. However, these light squares in white's positions are now highlighted more than they were before. Okay, queen to d2 played, queen to g4 coming into the light squares, pawn to h3. This isn't really a weakness because black has no way to exploit the dark squares, so this is fine, h3 is fine. Queen to g6, queen to f2, h5, king h2, a5. Okay, now since both you and your opponent have a weak color complex to use and to exploit, what you want to do is you want to restrict your opponent's bishop as much as possible. Bishop to a3, b5, threatening b4, bishop c5, b4 anyway, taking away squares. And two more things you have to think of in these sorts of middle games. The first one, as we saw, is increasing control over the key color complex. The second one is looking for weaknesses in the position. In this case, you could argue that the only weakness is the a2 pawn and the b3 pawn, which can hardly be exploited in this case. The third thing is you have to think about favorable endgames. Even though opposite colored bishop endgames tend to end in a draw, in many cases you can transpose into an endgame which is easily winning despite it being opposite colored bishops. Okay, rook cc1, rook dc8. I just want to show you one mistake and then we will move on to the other game. So the players maneuvered. Botvinnik is trying to get into the light squares. He advances with a4. Rook c8 played takes, and queen e8. Of course, the a4 pawn cannot be defended. Queen a4. Okay, so he has highlighted the one mistake. Fine, a2 is weak. The other thing is the c2 square is extremely weak. As we saw, the dark squares are weak. And of course, black's pieces are much better. It should still be equal, but from a practical perspective, black has achieved everything he could. So black has managed to weaken the color complex to a maximum. He has managed to highlight the only weakness to a maximum. And he has managed to create a potential infiltration square. Now, sometimes, even if you do everything correctly, it's not enough, and white can hold the position with something like queen e2 and simply waiting. And black doesn't really have a way to improve his position. He would have to defend on h5, maybe rook to b2 attacking the pawn, rook to c4 defending, and white should hold this position. However, Alexander Kotov, who is a very strong player, blundered here. He played queen to h4, and queen h4 attacks a pawn. That's great. However, it allows rook to c2. And now black has gained a decisive advantage. This has to be taken, or the queen takes on a2, and then your g2 pawn is falling, so takes. Okay, queen to g3, time to defend because mate was threatened on g2, and now queen takes a2. Okay, and what Kotov was counting on was bishop f6, but now we do reach a winning endgame, which Botvinnik has correctly assessed. And yeah, if you would like to know more about endgames like this, watch the video on opposite colored bishops endgames, and you will find instructions to win positions like this over there. Okay, let's move on. The second position is very different to the first one. So again, we have a scenario where it's opposite colored bishops in the middle game. Again, opposite colored bishops have to favor the side that's attacking. That's a key concept here. And again, you want to exploit the weak color complex as much as possible. Now this is a Nimzo, so in some Nimzo Indian positions, black wanders far away with his knight to attack the c4 pawn. So sometimes it will be even easier for white to attack because all the pieces are on the queen side. And in this case, Svetozar Gligoric sort of messed it up, and I chose this position because he did mess it up, and I'll show you how Borislav Ivkov could have exploited that. Now, in this position, Gligoric put the knight into f5 straight away, and this seems like a nice move. d6 is weak, the queen is attacked, seemingly the knight cannot be taken because the rook is loose. However, if the knight is taken, the tables are completely turned. Okay, let me show you what Ivkov should have done. So gf5, of course, queen h5 was the idea, and now pawn to f4. And again, the engines are going to say this is equal, maybe white is slightly better. However, look at the color complexes now, look at the weaknesses now. Firstly, c4 is weak, okay? Secondly, h3 is weak. This bishop could easily come to this diagonal and threaten some nasty stuff. Black is going to castle queenside, black is going to put his rook on g8, black is going to play f3, black is going to play bishop takes h3, and this is just a tremendous position for black. I mean, if you gave this to grandmasters, I'm sure most of them would choose black here, despite white being the exchange up. So this goes to show how little is needed for the side with a potential attack to be better. Okay, coming back to the starting position, knight f5 was a mistake because black is given the opportunity to take and play this annoying move f4. This means that black is the one with the attacking chances and that this bishop is just completely dead. This bishop isn't going anywhere. So now basically black is playing a piece up because this bishop is dead. Okay, instead of that, I'll show you what happened in the game. Ivkov simply messed it up. He played queen to f8, and now f4 was played, and now, of course, after f4, it's not possible to play f4 anymore. So now if you take, then I just take your rook for free, and you don't have f4, so that wouldn't work. I'll show you what happened a bit later. So how should have Gligoric approach this position? Well, knight f5 and f4 is the correct idea, but you have to make sure that black doesn't improve his bishop with the move f4, so you start with f4. And after f4, this position is very hard to play. If the pawn is taken, then knight f5 is simply winning, because if you take, then rook takes, again you don't have f4. f4 is now a weakness, and your whole position is crumbling. If you take on e4 with the queen, I win your rook, everything is just falling apart. Okay, and after f4, if castles is played, then simply f5. And now this bishop has, well, his fate is now sealed. Its fate is now sealed because the pawn is on f5 and not on f4, which means that this bishop is great, this bishop is bad, white is the one with all the winning chances. Okay, but what happened in the game was queen f8, f4, it wasn't taken of course, but rook to h8, now threatening to win the knight. And now a perfect combination to end the game, queen check, king to d8, and knight takes d6, a completely winning knight sacrifice, because after queen takes d6, f takes e5. There is nothing black can do to defend the dark squares anymore. Neither of these three pieces can get into the game, and basically this rook, this bishop, and this queen are going to be decisive. If the pawn is taken, then rook takes f7, and it's a mate in a couple of moves. You would have to give up your queen. So queen c7 was played, and now bishop g5. Just horrible. King c8. d6, and everything is crumbling. Queen to c6. You can even exchange queens, doesn't really matter. Knight c6, rook f7, and yeah, game over. Knight e5 was played, rook c7 was played, king b8, bishop f6, rook e8, rook e7, and yeah, he got his piece back, and of course a completely winning endgame. So coming back to the starting position, you need to be able to recognize what's going on and how you can increase the pressure on a color complex, how you can amplify the power of your bishop, while at the same time making sure your opponent's bishop remains locked in. And in this case, the move f4, getting the move f4 in before black can react was key. Okay, the next game, I wanted to show you this game because of the principle of two weaknesses. And this game was, this was a Blitz game, and a move previous to this, Kasparov had actually blundered g5, and black could have won a rook, but never mind that. In this position he did play rook e4, saving a piece. But what's important here is, again, we have opposite colored bishops. Again, we want to amplify the power of our bishop and the weakness of our opponent's dark squares, and we don't want him to do the same thing to us. Now, as we are going to see in this example and in the next example, there is a strategic idea in positions like this, which I don't know how to call it. I call it creeping in, and it's basically playing several moves with your pieces, which are not your bishop, to creep into the weakened squares. And if you don't think that way in a position like this, maybe you will not be able to play it as well. Now, here there's only one way to enter the position. Everything is closed except for this diagonal. So one of the key ideas here is for black to play the move h5 and the move queen to h6 and come in somewhere, either d2 or c1. Okay, maybe the rook moves so you can get into e3. If you manage to do that, the pressure has increased. So white, in this case Kasparov, has to think, okay, I have to keep my queen on f4 or on d2 or on c1 to prevent that. If black doesn't get his queen into play, it's very unlikely that I'm going to get mated, or that the bishop pair is going to, the bishop and the queen are going to be that powerful. However, there's a second problem in this position. If you have a dark squared bishop, your opponent has a light squared bishop, and there are dark squared weaknesses, in this case the pawn on e5, he has a very hard time defending that. So the second idea here could be to increase the pressure on the pawn on e5, which can only be defended by the two major pieces, and you have a minor piece attacking it. So that's another thing to bear in mind. Here's what happened. Rook d8 was played, queen to f4, which is correct, and bishop to c3. It doesn't really do much, but fine. He could have played h5. I think in this position, after rook e4, h5 was the best move immediately. And now Kasparov has to play queen f4. You can continue rook d8 now, doesn't really matter. Maybe g3 to bring your king closer. Maybe bishop c3 now, trying to come in. King to g2. White is the one who has to be very, very careful, because there's a weakness here. The rook could come into d4 and trade off the defender. Okay, so coming back here. The idea behind rook d8 is to move the bishop away and to play rook to d4. If you can trade this rook off and then play something like queen to b8, the e5 pawn is dropping. Okay, very simple. Queen f4 played, bishop c3, h4, h5, g4. Now g4 loses the game. It's just too loose. Instead of that, I don't know what to suggest. Maybe g3, maybe king h2, maybe queen f3. It's very hard at this point. Before g4, I'm going to tell you the evaluation actually. It's minus 0.4. So the engine thinks it's almost equal. However, for a human, preventing this and preventing the trade on e4 and queen b8 is very hard. Okay, so, and it's a blitz game, so g4. H4, queen g4, queen h6, we are coming in. King to g2, rook to d4, trading of the defender, h5, queen d2 check, declining a queen trade. Now, weakness on e5, of course, and the potential to checkmate, which is exactly what happened. Queen e4, king h6, queen a8. Kasparov is trying to do the same thing, but it doesn't really work. This is now a forced checkmate, and in this position, his opponent sort of messed it up, but Kasparov resigned. There was a forced mate with queen to f2 check, king to d1, and bishop to e3. And there's just nothing white can do. He can give a couple of spite checks. So coming back to the original position after rook e4, this weakness and the fact that the queen is able to come in were decisive. And even Kasparov cannot defend positions which are equal, but black has two weaknesses to exploit and white has none. I thought this was a very interesting position, very instructive. And I mean, if you want to go over this part of the video once again, I think it's very important. Okay, the next position is an old game from Capablanca. One of Capablanca's first matches. He's playing Corzo, his nemesis in Cuba, the second best player in Cuba ever. And again, we have a position with opposite colored bishops. Now, what white wants to do is creep in. It's a bit harder than in the previous position, and there are no apparent weaknesses here. So what you have to do is you have to blow open the c file to be able to do anything, basically. So he starts with c5. I mean, the engine suggests some other moves, but from a human perspective, this is a great idea. Rook fc1 played, rook fc1 played, rook fc8 played, and now d4 by Capablanca. Now, d4 is a weird move. The engine actually likes it. I would never play it because it weakens the e4 square, but then again, black is threatening to play c4 and then get into e4 anyway. So d4 I can understand. Okay, bishop a6, tempo move, queen e1, and now pawn to c4. And I would like to talk about pawn to c4 because it's the only mistake, a very serious mistake in the game so far. This is actually a blunder. Now, Capablanca did not use it in any way. He played bc4, and then after bishop c4, white is clearly better, and we are going to see what happened. However, if we know that we want to prevent our opponent from amplifying the strength of his bishop, then what's the logical move here? It's of course b4. And we want to set up a blockade in the best way possible to make sure we don't get destroyed. So a variation like this is possible. Of course, bishop b5 is the idea to get here, but bishop to c3. And even though black is more passive, even though black is worse in this position, I don't think, white, I don't think black can win this. I don't think black has enough to win this position, and I don't think a plan of bishop a4 and bishop to b3 is enough. A bishop on b3 is not as powerful as a bishop here or here. It's just not. So after queen e1, black had to play the move bishop to d3. Okay, and after bishop to d3, you can play c4 because b4 is just a stupid move. And now you have established a very strong bishop on these two squares, and you have a permanent advantage. After c4, though, Capablanca returned the favor, took on c4. And bishop takes c4, and of course now this bishop can get in anywhere. Okay, bishop c3, queen a4, starting to creep in. And this is what I was talking about with this concept. What he wants to do is get the queen somewhere over here. If he can do that, then his pressure on the position increases. Queen d2 played, rook c6, doubling up rooks, perfect. King h2 doesn't do anything, bishop a6. The idea behind bishop a6 is to transfer the queen somehow via c4 into d3 and into e4. Queen b2 played, putting pressure on b6, bishop d3, bishop to d2, and now the perfect move. I mean, if you want, this is a very nice strategic idea. Pause the video, find a way to creep into the light squares. Okay, he did it with bishop to c2. And the idea is, of course, to do this with the queen. There is absolutely nothing white can do about it now. And the queen is coming to e4. Okay, king g3 played, queen c4 played, king f2, queen d3, king e1, and now h5. It was more precise to play the move b5 to simply gain even more control over the light squares. It's not possible to take the pawn because queen takes e3 would lead to checkmate after king f1, bishop d3. So against b5 there really is no response. That would have been much quicker. Instead he played h5, which gave his opponent Capablanca to play a4, which prevents b5. Okay, but now a tactical solution: bishop a4, rook c6, rook c6, and rook a3. If rook a4 is played, then of course rook to c2 and white can resign because it's either mate or you lose the queen. So rook a3 played, and now we reach a completely winning endgame. This is something I wouldn't like to talk about. Of course, two passed pawns and black just wins. But it's interesting to see how after bc4, bishop c4, Corzo maneuvered his queen into a4, then slowly maneuvered his bishop over here, then transferred the queen to c4 and to d3, and only then moved the bishop back to a4. This is a perfect example of creeping in, and this is one of my favorite opposite colored bishops, middle games. Okay, the last example is similar to the Kasparov game in a sense, but white has much more counterplay. This is Alekhine Rubinstein from 1910. I think it was a practice game, but I found sources that it says it's an exhibition game. I don't really know. So let's see what's going on here. Black's light squares are under complete control because of this bishop. Therefore, it's very hard for white to increase the attacking pressure. After rook f7, which defends g7, maybe some bishop h6 ideas, but not really because the back rank is defended. So regarding white's attacking chances, there are none. Okay. Even though this looks nice, it doesn't do anything. Now let's look at the weaknesses. Black's attacking chances first. Well, for the moment, nothing's really going on. However, since the light squares are so weak, if the queen manages to come in with the bishop, then white is going to be in trouble. Weaknesses. Black has no weaknesses. Okay, black has 0 weaknesses in this position. White has a major weakness, which if it drops, the whole position collapses, and that's the pawn on e4. So what we want to do here is increase the pressure on e4, make sure either e4 drops or we get in our queen and bishop favorably into white's position. Before we do that, probably getting your rooks to the d file is a good idea. Okay, so those are concepts. Now, getting that done can be done in several ways, depends on what your opponent wants to do, but you have a permanent advantage because he has a permanent weakness and you have a clear plan. Rook d1 played, queen c7, queen to c2, and rook to d8. You cannot take on a2 because your rook is loose on f7 in the end of that. So, for example, bishop takes a2, b3, you may think queen a5, but rook a1, bishop b3, queen b3 takes, queen attacked, rook attacked, and you lose your piece down. So after queen c2, rook d8 was played, simply challenging the d file. You don't mind trading off a couple of pieces. It's not the end of the world. In fact, if a pair of rooks is traded off, the weaknesses will be even more highlighted because it's one less defender able to support the e4 pawn. But Alekhine did not take. He played king f2, rook f to d7. Perfect. Queen a4. Attacks the bishop, which is gladly going to move into e4. I mean, queen a4 is just a desperate move. I think he knew he was lost at this point. Bishop d3 was played. b5 was even stronger. Of course, this cannot be taken because rook a8 and queen has no squares. So probably rook d7 would be played, and queen d7 and queen c2, and now we're just coming in. Bishop d3, everything is falling off. So b5 was more precise. Rubinstein did not find it. He played bishop to d3, which is fine. And queen to b4 played in anticipation of b5, because that would have won the pawn. okay, b5 anyway. Rook to g4 played, which defends the e4 pawn. So as soon as white has to resort to defending his pawn with the rook, and the pawn is attacked by a bishop, that means that this rook is opposing this guy. So white is using 5 points to defend against 3 points in theory. So that's bad. And now again, creeping in. This is just perfect, bishop to e2. This of course cannot be taken. If you take with the king, I take your rook. So you basically are forced to trade rooks, and after rook takes d7, queen takes d7, again, you cannot take the bishop, because if you take the bishop, then queen d1 check, and this rook falls, and black wins. So after queen takes d7, rook g1 was played, retreating, bishop to h5, a very nice move, preparing to deliver checks on the e2 square, and now you can see how all of these are weak and how white has no control over a single color complex, while at the same time, in theory, this bishop should be exerting pressure on black's position, but in practice, that's never going to happen. Rook e1, queen to d3, creeping in, almost no way to defend the pawn now. Queen e7, h6, just making sure he doesn't get mated. King to g1, king h7, very safe, and bishop to f2 played. Alechin wrote queen c7 was better, but it's all the same, it all loses. And now coming into the light squares is very, very easy. Queen h3, if you take the rook, I play bishop f3 and win. Bishop d4 was played, which is a very weird move. Bishop f3, king f2, queen g2, king e3, bishop e4. And this is how the game ended. It's of course completely hopeless. And yeah, you're going to lose your rook. And you're going to lose everything. It's just game over. Okay, so yeah, this position I think was also really nice because it showed how if you are the one attacking, it's going to be much easier to play and more likely for your opponent to blunder. Okay, I hope you guys liked this middle game video. Let me know what you think. I'm going to continue the middle game series. I have about 10 interesting videos planned. I'm really looking forward to see what you guys think. Okay, thank you for watching. See you guys later. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.